Chapter 9 of Jimbo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jimbo by Algernon Blackwood. Read by Adrian Pretzelis. Chapter 9. The Means of Escape. A week passed, and Jimbo began to wonder if the pains he so much dreaded, yet so eagerly longed for, were ever coming at all. The imprisonment was telling upon him, and he grew very thin, and consequently very light. The nights, though he spent them alone, were easily borne, for he was then intensely occupied, and the time passed swiftly. The moment it was dark he stepped into the gallery of memories, and in a little while passed into a new world of wonder and delight. But the daytime seemed always long. He stood for hours by the window, watching the trees and the sky, and what he saw always set painful currents running through his blood, unsatisfied longings, yearnings, and immense desires he could never understand. The white clouds on their swift journeys took with them something from his heart every time he looked upon them. They melted into air and blue sky, and lo, that something came back to him, charged with all the wild freedom and magic of open spaces, distance, and rushing winds. But the change was close at hand. One night, as he was standing by the open window, listening to the drip of the rain, he felt a deadly weakness steal over him. The strength went out of his legs. First he turned hot, and then he turned cold. Clammy perspiration broke out all over him, and it was all he could do to crawl across the room and throw himself onto the bed. But no sooner was he stretched out on the mattress than the feelings passed entirely, and behind left them an intoxicating sense of strength and lightness. His muscles became like steel springs. His bones were strong as iron and light as cork. A wonderful vigour had suddenly come into him, and he felt as if he had just stepped from a dungeon into fresh air. He was ready to face anything in the world. But before he had time to realize the full enjoyment of these new sensations, a stinging, blinding pain shot suddenly through his right shoulder, as if a red-hot iron had pierced to the very bone. He screamed out in agony, though even while he screamed the pain passed. Then the same thing happened to his other shoulder. It shot through his back with equal swiftness, and was gone, leaving him lying on the bed, trembling with pain. But the instant it was gone, delightful sensations of strength and lightness returned, and he felt as if his whole body were charged with some new and potent force. The pains had come at last. Jimbo had no notion how they could possibly be connected with escape, but Miss Lake, his kind and faithful friend Miss Lake, had said that no escape was possible without them, and had promised that they should be brief, and this was true, for the entire episode had not taken a minute of time. Escape! Escape! The words rushed through him like a flame of fire. Out of this dreadful empty house, into the open spaces, beyond the prison wall, out where the wind and the rain could touch him, where he could feel the grass beneath his feet, and could see the whole sky at once, instead of this narrow strip through the window. His thoughts flew to the stars and the clouds. But a strange humming of voices interrupted his flight of imagination, and he saw that the room was suddenly full of moving figures. They were passing before him with silent footsteps across the window from door to door. How they had come in, or how they went out, he never knew, but his heart stood still for an instant as he recognized the mournful figures of the frightened children filing before him in a slow procession. They were singing, though it sounded more like a chorus of whispering than actual singing, and as they moved past with the measured steps of their sorrowful dance, he caught the words of the song he had heard them sing when he first came into the house. We hear the little voices in the wind, singing of freedom we may never find. Jimbo put his fingers into his ears, but still the sound came through. He heard the words almost as if they were inside himself, his own thoughts, singing, "We hear the little footsteps in the rain, running to help us, though they run in vain, tapping in hundreds on the window pane." The horrible procession filed past and melted away near the door. They were gone as mysteriously as they had come, and almost before he realized it. He sprang from the bed and tried the doors. Both were locked. How in the world had the children got in and out? The whispering voices rose again on the night air, and this time he was sure they came from outside. He ran to the open window and thrust his head out cautiously. Sure enough, the procession was moving slowly, still with the steps of that impish dance, across the courtyard stones. He could just make out the slow waving arms, the thin bodies, and the white little faces as they passed on silent feet through the darkness, and again a fragment of the song rose to his ears as he watched, and filled him with an overpowering sadness. "We have no joy in any children's game, for happiness to us is but a name, since terror kissed us with his lips of flame." Then he noticed that the group was growing smaller. Already the numbers were less. Somewhere, over there in the dark corner of the yard, the children disappeared, though it was too dark to see precisely how or where. "We dance with phantoms and with shadows play," rose to his ears. Then suddenly he remembered the little white upright stones he had seen in that corner of the yard, and understood. One by one they vanished just behind those stones. Jimbo shivered and drew his head in. He did not like those upright stones. They made him uncomfortable and afraid. Now, however, the last child had disappeared, and the song had ceased. He realized what his fate would be if the escape were not successful. He would become one of this band of frightened children, dwelling somewhere behind the upright stones, a terrified shadow, waiting in vain to be rescued, waiting perhaps for ever and ever. The thought brought the tears to his eyes, but he somehow managed to choke them down. He knew it was the young portion of him only that felt afraid, the body. The older self could not feel fear, and had nothing to do with tears. He lay down again on the hard mattress and waited, and soon afterwards the first crimson streaks of sunrise appeared behind the high elms, and rooks began to caw and shake their wings in the upper branches. A little later the governess came in. Before he could move out of the way, for he disliked being embraced, she had her arms round his neck and was covering him with kisses. He saw tears in her eyes. "You darling Jimbo," she cried, "they've come at last." "How do you know?" he asked, surprised at her knowledge, and puzzled by her display of emotion. "I heard you scream to begin with. Besides, I've been watching." "Watching?" "Yes, and listening too. Every night, every single night. You've hardly been a minute out of my sight," she added. "I think it's awfully good of you," he said doubtfully, "but—" A flood of questions followed, about the upright stones, the shadowy children, where she spent the night, watching him, and 100 other things besides. But he got little satisfaction out of her. He never did when it was Jimbo, the child, that asked, and he remained Jimbo, the child, all that day. She only told him that all was going well. The pains had come, he had grown nice and thin and light. The children had come into his room as a hint that he belonged to their band, and other things had happened about which she would tell him later. The crisis was close at hand. That was all he could get out of her. "It won't be long now," she said excitedly. "They'll come tonight, I expect." "What will come tonight?" he asked with tremendous wonder. "Wait and see," was all the answer he got. "Wait and see." She told him to lie quietly on the bed and to have patience. With asking questions and thinking and wondering, the day passed very quickly. With the lengthening shadows his excitement began to grow. Presently Miss Lake took her departure, and went off to her unknown and mysterious abode. He watched her disappear through the floor with mingled feelings, wondering what would have happened before he saw her again. She gave him a long last look as she sank away below the boards, but it was a look that brought him fresh courage, and her eyes were happy and smiling. Tingling already with expectancy, he got into the bed and lay down, his brain alive with one word: escape. From where he lay he saw the stars in the narrow strip of sky. He heard the wind whispering in the branches. He even smelt the perfume of the fields and hedges, grass, flowers, dew, and the sweet earth, the odours of freedom. The governess had, for some reason she refused to explain, taken his blouse away with her. For a long time he puzzled over this, seeking reasons and finding none. But while in the act of stroking his bare arms, the pains of the night before suddenly returned to both shoulders at once. Fire seemed to run down his back, splitting his bones apart, and then passed even more quickly than before, leaving him with the same wonderful sensations of lightness and strength. He felt inclined to shout and run and jump, and it was only the memory of the governess's earnest caution to lie quietly that prevented his new emotions passing into acts. With very great effort he lay still all night long, and it was only when the room at last began to get light again that he turned on his side preparatory to getting up. But there was something new, something different. He rested on his elbow, waiting. Something had happened to him. Cautiously he sat on the edge of the bed, and stretched out one foot and touched the floor. Excitement ran through him like a wave. There was a great change, a tremendous change, for as he stepped out gingerly onto the floor, something followed him from the bed. It clung to his back, it touched both shoulders at once, it stroked his ribs and tickled the skin of his arms. Half frightened, he brought the other leg over and stood boldly upright on both feet, but the weight still clung to his back. He looked over his shoulder. Yes, it was trailing after him from the bed. It was fan-shaped and brilliant in colour. He put out a hand and touched it. It was soft and glossy. Then he took it deliberately between his fingers. It was smooth as velvet, and had numerous tiny ribs running along it. Seizing it at last with all his courage, he pulled it forward in front of him for a better view, only to discover that it would not come out beyond a certain distance, and seemed to have got caught somehow between his shoulders, just where the pains had been. A second pull, more vigorous than the first, showed that it was not caught but fastened to his skin. It divided itself, moreover, into two portions, one half coming from each shoulder. "I do believe they're feathers!" he exclaimed, his eyes almost popping out of his head. Then, with a sudden flash of comprehension, he saw it all and understood. They were indeed feathers, but they were something more than feathers merely. They were wings. Jimbo caught his breath and stared in silence. He felt dazed. Then, bit by bit, the fragments of the weird mosaic fell into their proper places, and he began to understand. Escape was to be by flight. It filled him with such a whirlwind of delight and excitement that he could scarcely keep from screaming aloud. Lost in wonder, he took a step forward, and watched with bulging eyes how the wings followed him, their tips trailing along the floor. They were a beautiful deep red, and hung down close and warm beside his body, glossy, sleek, magical. And when later the sun burst into the room and turned their colour into living flame, he could not resist the temptation to kiss them. He seized them and rubbed their soft surfaces over his face. Such colours he had never seen before, and he wanted to be sure that they really belonged to him and were intended for actual use. Slowly, without using his hands, he raised them into the air. The effort was a perfectly easy muscular effort from the shoulders that came naturally, though he did not quite understand how he accomplished it. The wings rose in a fine, graceful sweep, curving over his head till the tips of the feathers met, touching the walls as they rose, and almost reaching to the ceiling. He gave a howl of delight, for this sight was more than he could manage without some outlet for his pent-up emotion, and at the same moment the trap-door shot open, and the governess came into the room with such a bang and a clatter that Jimbo knew at once her excitement was as great as his own. In her hand she carried the blouse she had taken away the night before. She held it out to him without a word. Her eyes were shining like electric lamps. In less than a second he had slipped his wings through the neatly made slits, but before he could practice them again, Miss Blake rushed over to him, her face radiant with happiness. "Jimbo, my darling Jimbo!" she cried, and then stopped short, apparently unable to express her emotion. The next instant he was enveloped, wings and all, in a warm confusion of kisses, congratulations, and folds of hood. When they became disentangled again, the governess went down on her knees and made a careful examination. She pulled the wings out to their full extent, and found they stretched about 4 feet and a half from tip to tip. "They are beauties," she exclaimed enthusiastically, "and full grown and strong. I'm not surprised they took so long coming." "Long?" he echoed. "I thought they came awfully quickly." "Not half so quickly as they'll go," she interrupted, adding when she saw his expression of dismay, "I mean, you'll fly like the wind with them." Jimbo was simply breathless with excitement. He wanted to jump out of the window and escape at once. The blue sky and the sunshine and the white clouds sent him an irresistible invitation. He could not wait a minute longer. "Quick!" he cried. "I can't wait. They may go again. Show me how to use them. Oh, do show me." "I'll show you everything in time," she answered. There was something in her voice that made him pause in his excitement. He looked at her in silence for some minutes. "But how are you going to escape?" he asked at length. "You haven't got—" He stopped short. The governess stepped back a few paces from him. She threw back the hood from her face. Then she lifted the long black cloak that hung like a cassock almost to her ankles, and had always enveloped her hitherto. Jimbo started. Falling from her shoulders, and folding over her hips, he saw the long red feathers similar to his own, and when he dashed forward to touch them with his own hands, he found that they were just as sleek and smooth and glossy as his own. "And you never told me all this time?" he gasped. "It was safer not," she said. "You'd have been stroking and feeling your shoulders the whole time, and the wings might never have come at all." She spread out her wings as they spoke, to their full extent. They were nearly 6 feet across, and the deep crimson on the underside was so exquisite, gleaming in the sunlight, that Jimbo ran in and nestled between the feathers, tickling his cheeks and the fluffy surface, and running his fingers with childish delight along the slender red quills. "You precious child," she said, tenderly folding her wings round him and kissing the top of his head. "Always remember that I really love you. No matter what happens, remember that, and I'll save you." "And we shall escape together?" he asked, submitting for once to the caresses with a good grace. "We shall escape from the empty house together," she replied evasively. "How far we can go after that depends on you." "On me?" If you love me enough, as I love you, Jimbo, we can never separate again, because love ties us together forever. Only," she added, "it must be mutual." "I love you very much," he said, puzzled a little. "Of course I do." "If you've really forgiven me for being the cause of your coming here," she said questioningly, "we can always be together. But—" "I don't remember, but I've forgiven you, that old you, long ago," he said simply. "If you hadn't brought me here, I should never have met you." "That's not real forgiveness, quite," she sighed, half to herself. But Jimbo could not follow this sort of conversation for long. He was too anxious to try his wings, for one thing. "Is it very difficult to use them?" he asked. "Try," she said. He stood in the centre of the floor and raised them again and again. They swept up easily, meeting over his head, and the air whistled musically through them. Evidently they had their proper muscles, for it was no great effort, and when he folded them again by his side they fell into natural curves over his arms, as if they had been there all his life. The sound of the feathers threshing the air filled him with delight, and made him think of the big night-bird that had flown past the window during the night. He told the governess about it, and she burst out laughing. "I was that big bird," she said. "You?" "I perched on the roof every night to watch over you. I flew down that time because I was afraid you were trying to climb out of the window." This was indeed a proof of devotion, and Jimbo felt that he could never doubt her again. And when she went on to tell him about his wings and how to use them, he listened with his very best attention, and tried hard to learn and understand. "The great difficulty is that you can't practice properly," she explained. "There's no room in here, and yet you can't get out till you fly out. It's the first swoop that decides it all. You'll have to drop straight out of this window, and if you use the wings properly, they will carry you in a single swoop over the wall and right up into the sky." "But if I miss?" "You can't miss," she said with decision. "But if you did, you would be a prisoner here forever. He would catch you in the yard and tear your wings off. It is just as well that you should know this at once." Jimbo shuddered as he heard her. "When can we try?" he asked anxiously. "Very soon now. The muscles must harden first, and that takes a little time. You must practice flapping your wings until you can do it easily 400 times a minute. When you can do that, it will be time for the first start. You must keep your head steady and not get giddy. The novelty of the motion, the ground rushing up into your face and the whistling of the wind, are apt to confuse at first, but it soon passes, and you must have confidence. I can only help you up to a certain point. The rest depends on you." "And the first jump?" "You'll have to make that by yourself," she said. "But you'll do it all right. You're very light and won't go too near the ground. You see, we are like bats and cannot rise from the earth. We can only fly by dropping from a height, and that's what makes the first plunge rather trying. But you won't fall," she added, "and remember, I shall always be within reach." "You're awfully kind to me," said Jimbo, feeling his little soul more than ever invaded by the force of her unselfish care. "I promise you I'll do my best." He climbed onto her knee and stared into her anxious face. "Then you are beginning to love me a little, aren't you?" she asked softly, putting her arms round him. "Yes," he said decidedly. "I love you very much already." 400 times a minute sounded a very great deal of wing flapping, but Jimbo practised eagerly, and though at first he could only manage about twice a second, or 120 times a minute, he found this increased very soon to a great deal more, and before long he was able to do the full 400, though only for a few minutes at a time. He stuck at it pluckily, getting stronger every day. The governess encouraged him as much as possible, but there was very little room for her while he was at work, and he found the best way to practice was at night, when she was out of the way. She told him that a large bird moved its wings about 4 times a second, 2 upstrokes and 2 downstrokes, but a small bird, like a partridge, moved its wings so rapidly it was impossible for the eye to distinguish or count the strokes. A middle course of 400 suited his own case best, and he bent all his energies to acquire it. He also learned that the convex upside curve of wings allowed the wind to escape over them, while the underside, being concave, held every breath. Thus the upward stroke did not simply counterbalance the downward, and keep him stationary. Moreover, she showed him how the feathers underlapped each other, so that the downward stroke pressed them closely together to hold the wind, whereas in the upward stroke they opened and separated, letting the air slip easily through them, thus offering less resistance to the atmosphere. By the end of the week Jimbo had practised so hard that he could keep himself off the floor in mid-air for half an hour at a time, and even then without feeling any great fatigue. His excitement became intense, and meanwhile, in his body on the nursery bed, though he did not know it, the fever was reaching its crisis. He could think of nothing else but the joys of flying, and what the first awful plunge would be like, and when Miss Lake came up to him one afternoon and whispered something in his ear, he was so wildly happy that he hugged her for many minutes without the slightest coaxing. "It's bright and clear," she exclaimed, "and Fright will not come after us, for he fears the light, and can only fly on dark and gloomy nights." "So we can start?" he stammered joyfully. "To-night," she answered, "for our first practice flight." End of chapter 9.